In previous videos, I presented undeniable evidence of life after death and explained where we go afterward. I also clarified what dreams truly are and showed the tragic consequences that suicides face after death. Additionally, I presented 3 of the many near-death experience stories that I have collected over more than 20 years of researching death and life beyond the material body. If you haven't watched them yet, I encourage you to click on the name of my channel in the video tab, where you'll find all the videos I have created so far. In this episode, I will present another NDE story from my collection. It will be the story of an elderly woman who experienced clinical death due to a heart attack. During this experience, an angel showed her how much she had changed for the worse with age.
This story will be about my grandmother, Zosia, who passed away a year ago. And this was essentially her second death. This time, unfortunately, final. The first one occurred during a heart attack she suffered 2 years earlier, and that event changed her significantly. Or rather, it didn't so much change her as it allowed her to become herself again. Because when my grandfather Lutzek died 8 years ago, my grandmother became increasingly bitter with each passing day. Of course, I didn't blame her for this. After all, she had lost her husband and was left alone in a big empty house in the countryside. We knew she was struggling, so we visited her and supported her. It hurt to see her like this because I remembered her from my childhood as an angel-like woman. She smiled a lot, was very sociable, and helped everyone, both family and neighbors. One of her neighbors always told me that my grandmother was a golden woman and would surely go to heaven. My grandmother was also an incredibly beautiful woman. She often told me that in her youth, my grandfather was insanely jealous of her. This jealousy often led to quarrels at parties. She said many boys chased after her, but my grandfather always chased them away. He was a real tough guy, a man of flesh and blood who only cancer could defeat. My grandmother took it very hard when she lost her protector and loyal companion of life. In the first few years after his death, my grandmother was just sad and depressed. Smiles rarely appeared on her face anymore. She became apathetic and disengaged from family life. I thought time would heal her wounds and that she would eventually recover. But the opposite happened. When we visited her, she increasingly criticized our actions. She disapproved of various decisions my parents made. At the time, I was a rebellious teenager, so I probably received the most criticism over my hairstyle, clothes, makeup, or spending too much time outside instead of studying. She changed so much that it became hard for me to be around her. Of course, I didn't stop visiting her because I knew her behavior was caused by the pain of my grandfather's death. My parents thought the same, especially my father, since she was his mother-in-law. I often heard him complaining to my mom, suggesting we visit Grandma on Sundays without him, so he could rest at home. He would find household chores to avoid visiting. And to think, just a few years earlier, he had bragged to Uncle Richard that no one had a better mother-in-law. The neighbors also eventually changed their opinion of her. She often clashed with them over trivial matters. Eventually, she even quarreled with her favorite neighbor about a tree on her property that supposedly posed a threat to my grandmother's farm building. She demanded that the neighbor cut it down, but the neighbor refused, saying my grandmother was just picking a fight. This dispute lasted for weeks until, during another confrontation, my grandmother got so upset that she had a heart attack. The neighbor immediately called an ambulance. My grandmother was in critical condition. They barely saved her, and when she got out of the hospital and felt better, I noticed a significant change in her behavior. She became kind, smiling, and helpful again. She stopped criticizing us and looking for quarrels with the neighbors. You could say she quickly became herself again and improved her relationships with almost everyone. I thought she was scared of death and decided to live peacefully and harmoniously to live as long as possible. But the reason for her change was much deeper. One Sunday, when my mum and I visited her, she decided to tell us what happened during her heart attack after lunch. The doctor had told my mum that she had briefly lost her vital signs, but they managed to revive her. My grandmother began to describe how she felt a sharp pain in her chest, like someone was stabbing her with a heated blade, and then she fell to the ground. She felt as if some force threw her upward, and she flew through a dark tunnel at great speed. She flew for a while until she saw a point of white light. It grew larger until it was big enough for her to fly into. She entered a bright tunnel from the dark one. She said the brightness was strange, very bright but not blinding. She had never seen such brightness in her life, not even from modern light bulbs. And when she entered this bright tunnel, she felt very calm and safe. This light radiated love, but not the ordinary love she felt for us, or my grandfather. It was a pure feeling of love she had never experienced on earth. At that moment, she thought she had reached heaven. The tunnel kept expanding until she eventually flew out of it and found herself in the clouds. She flew through them for a while until she saw a large golden gate. In front of it stood a mighty winged angel with blonde hair. He smiled at her and waved, beckoning her to come closer. She started flying toward him, and as she approached, she felt an immense kindness emanating from him. She knew he was completely benevolent toward her. The angel greeted her by name, and she asked if she was in heaven. He replied that it could be called that, though the true heaven was beyond that great gate. He asked if she wanted to enter. My grandmother, overjoyed, said she did. The angel smiled again and said he would let her in, but first, she needed to review her life. At first, my grandmother didn't understand what he meant, but soon images from her life started appearing before her. From the very beginning until the moment she had the heart attack, she remembered everything and relived it as if it were happening again. She said the angel stood by her side, but did not judge or criticize her for her wrongdoings, not even during the moments after my grandfather's death. Through these memories, my grandmother realized how much she had changed then. She said she had become jealous of the neighbors who still had their husbands, while she felt incomplete. She was irritated that she was already 70 and that life was slipping away. She could no longer experience what she had in her youth and felt she no longer mattered, with people paying less attention to her. She wanted to be young again and live life to the fullest, but it was impossible. So, she started envying others' youth and the fact that life was still ahead of them. That's why she was so critical and nitpicky toward us. My mom interrupted her, saying that there was nothing to apologize for and that she didn't have to explain herself. I saw her eyes well up with tears. My grandmother responded that it wasn't an apology but a warning for us for the future. She added that she was now living well with people again and felt much better, and that we must come to terms with death, prepare for it, instead of envying others' youth. My mum clearly had enough of the death talk, but my grandmother continued her story about the angel. After reviewing her life and drawing conclusions, the angel asked if she wanted to pass through the gate or return and end her life differently. My grandmother hesitated because, after all, it was about entering heaven. She had been a believer her whole life, and going to heaven is the ultimate goal of believers. However, she approached the angel cleverly and asked if she returned and completed her life. Would she be allowed to pass through the gate when she came back? The angel smiled and said yes. So she decided to return, and that's what happened. Once again, my grandmother repeated that she was telling us this as a warning. And she was telling us now because she felt that she would soon leave to pass through the promised gate. My mum couldn't take it anymore and told my grandmother to stop talking nonsense because she still had many years to live. She got up and went to wash the dishes after lunch. I saw her wiping away tears now and then. My grandmother also noticed, so she changed the subject. As for her feeling, she was unfortunately right. She died 2 weeks later in her sleep.
And so, another NDE story gives us great insight into life and death. We can learn that we must come to terms with death and prepare for it. We should reconcile our lives, do what is called a conscience check, and try to make amends to those we have wronged. This way, when our time comes, we will leave much more easily, with fewer experiences and attachments weighing us down. Another lesson from this story is not to envy youth and life in others. This not only worsens our behavior, but may also lead us to wish to reincarnate again after death, maybe even into the same body, to live this life once more. As you can see, our protagonist could have ended her incarnation, yet she returned to it. And what if, after her final departure, the being she described as an angel offered her the chance to live another life? Was she determined enough not to reincarnate again? Or did she succumb to the temptation of another adventure in the world of suffering? As I have often mentioned on this channel, it's easy to enter the wheel of reincarnation, but much harder to jump off once it's in motion. You can read more about this in my publication, where I have gathered all the knowledge about life beyond the material body that I've collected through over 20 years of research and personal experience. The link to purchase the book is in the description below the video. That's all for today. Thank you for your time and see you next time.